In the grim world of organized crime, there are few names as feared and reviled as Salvatore Toto Riina. Salvatore Toto Riina, also known as La Belva, the Beast, and Curtu, the Short One, was one of the most feared and hated figures in the world of organized crime. Riina led one of the bloodiest periods in Mafia history, leaving behind a legacy of violence, fear, and corruption that deeply affected Italy and the world. For more than 20 years, he controlled the Sicilian Mafia with a strong force, building his empire through murder and cruelty. Join us as we dive into the chilling life of Toto Riina, the world's most ruthless godfather. From his humble beginnings in the small town of Corleone to his terrifying rise as the head of the Sicilian Mafia, Riina's story is one of violence, fear, and control. Born on November 16, 1930, in the small rural town of Corleone, Sicily, Salvatore Riina grew up in the shadow of poverty. Corleone itself would later become synonymous with mafia lore, especially after the success of the Godfather movie. But the real-life Corleone was far from glamorous. In Riina's childhood, Sicily was a land of hardship, where power was often synonymous with violence, and the only way to survive was through strength or submission. He was the son of Giovanni Riina, a poor farmer, and Giuseppe Rizzo, his mother. Life was harsh, and the local mafia, known as the Cosa Nostra, dominated much of everyday life. In the early days of Salvatore Toto Riina's life, we see how a young man from a poor family in Corleone, Sicily, moved from small crimes to becoming one of the most feared leaders in the mafia. His story started with tough beginnings, filled with violence that grew into a powerful control over the mafia. At just 13 years old, Salvatore's life changed forever when his father died while trying to take gunpowder from an old World War II bomb. The explosion also killed his brother. The loss left his family in deep poverty and created a strong anger in Salvatore, leading him to a life of crime and revenge. After his father's death, Riina turned to minor crimes. By the age of 19, he had committed his first murder. He was found guilty of manslaughter after killing a man in a fight and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. This time in prison was very important for Riina, as it made him tougher and introduced him to important mafia leaders who would help him in the future. After he got out of prison in 1956, Riina went back to Corleone, but he was not just a small-time criminal anymore. He had built a tough reputation and became connected to the local mafia. He quickly earned the trust of the Corleone faction, a violent and ambitious group led by Luciano Leggio. With Luciano Leggio, Riina took on a bigger role in the mafia. The Corleone were known for their brutality. Unlike other mafia families that preferred negotiation and subtlety, the Corleone believed in using extreme violence to get what they wanted. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Riina became one of Leggio's most trusted helpers. His job was to carry out murders and make sure the Corleone got their way through fear and violence. A key moment in Riina's early career was when he helped kill Michele Navarra, the boss of the Corleone Mafia. Michele Navarra was the leader of the Corleone until 1958. Luciano Leggio, with help from Riina, wanted to replace Navarra and take over the group. This struggle for power was one of Riina's early big actions in the mafia. On August 2nd, 1958, Riina and Leggio attacked and killed Navarra in a violent event that helped Leggio become the new leader. Navarra's murder was important for two main reasons. It made Leggio the boss of the Corleone and confirmed Riina as an important player in the mafia. Riina showed he was ready to use extreme violence to reach his goals, a trait that defined his career. With Navarra gone, the Corleone became one of the strongest mafia families in Sicily. Leggio took charge, but Riina's influence grew with him. Together they started a wave of violence that spread across Corleone and into the larger mafia network. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, Riina's influence within the Corleone continued to grow. His cunning, strategic mind, and willingness to use extreme violence distinguished him as a natural leader. When Leggio was arrested and imprisoned in 1974, Riina assumed control of the Corleone and began transforming the faction into one of the most powerful and feared mafia families in Sicily. Under Riina's leadership, the Corleone became known for their unprecedented levels of brutality. Where other mafia families might have sought compromise or negotiation, Riina adopted a strategy of total domination. His goal was simple: absolute control of the Sicilian Mafia, no matter the cost in human lives. This ambition sparked what would come to be known as the Second Mafia War in the early 1980s, a violent conflict between the Corleone and other mafia families. The Second Mafia War was a bloodbath. Riina ordered the assassination of anyone who stood in his way, including high-ranking members of rival families, corrupt politicians, and even fellow mafiosi who dared question his authority. The conflict resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people, including women and children. Riina's disregard for traditional mafia rules, such as the protection of families and civilians, set him apart as one of the most feared bosses in mafia history. By the mid-1980s, Riina had achieved his goal. He emerged victorious from the Mafia War. The Corleone became the dominant faction in the Sicilian Mafia. Riina was now the undisputed capo dei capi, boss of bosses, ruling over a vast criminal empire that extended its tentacles into politics, business, and the international drug trade. His power was absolute, and his methods were savage. Once Riina had consolidated his power, his next step was to expand the mafia's operations. Under his leadership, the Sicilian Mafia flourished, particularly in the heroin trade. Riina was instrumental in forging international alliances with other criminal organizations, such as the American Mafia, facilitating the global distribution of drugs. The profits from heroin trafficking poured into the mafia's coffers, making Riina one of the wealthiest men in Italy. However, Riina's success came at a terrible cost. His rule was marked by widespread corruption, violence, and fear. He used his wealth and influence to buy political protection, bribing politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials to turn a blind eye to his activities. Those who refused to cooperate were often marked for death. Under Riina, Sicily became a place where terror reigned supreme, and no one, not even high-ranking officials, were safe from his wrath. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Riina's most infamous act of violence would further solidify his reputation as one of the world's most ruthless criminals. His most high-profile killings were the anti-mafia prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two men that had dedicated their lives to dismantling the mafia. Falcone and Borsellino were part of a group of courageous judges and prosecutors who had successfully led investigations into the mafia's operations. They were instrumental in the 1986 to 1987 Maxi trial, a massive legal case that saw hundreds of mafiosi convicted and sent to prison. Riina viewed the Maxi trial as a direct threat to his power, and he responded with lethal force. In May 1992, Riina ordered the assassination of Giovanni Falcone. A massive bomb was planted beneath a motorway outside Palermo. As Falcone's car passed, the bomb was detonated, killing Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards. Just 2 months later, in July 1992, Riina's men struck again, this time killing Paolo Borsellino with a car bomb in Palermo. The deaths of Falcone and Borsellino sent shockwaves throughout Italy and galvanized public outrage against the mafia. Riina's reign of terror had reached its zenith, but it would also prove to be his undoing. For over 2 decades, Toto Riina had managed to evade justice, living as a fugitive while orchestrating his criminal empire from the shadows. Despite his notoriety, he had remained elusive, protected by a complex network of loyal associates and corrupt officials. However, by the early 1990s, the tide was beginning to turn against him. The murders of Falcone and Borsellino marked a turning point in Italy's war against the mafia. The public outrage following their deaths forced the Italian government to take decisive action. Under pressure from the public and international community, Italian law enforcement intensified their efforts to capture Riina. The key breakthrough came in 1993, when an informant within the mafia provided crucial information about Riina's whereabouts. On January 15, 1993, after 23 years on the run, Salvatore Riina was finally captured by Italian authorities in Palermo. His arrest was a major victory for the Italian government and dealt a significant blow to the mafia's leadership. Riina was quickly put on trial, where he was convicted of numerous crimes, including murder, drug trafficking, and extortion. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence he would serve in isolation under Italy's harsh 41-bis prison regime, designed to prevent mafia bosses from continuing to run their operations from behind bars. Despite his imprisonment, Riina continued to wield influence over the mafia. From his prison cell, he maintained contact with his associates, and there were reports that he had ordered hits on individuals even while incarcerated. However, his power slowly waned as law enforcement continued to crack down on the mafia. After Riina's arrest, the leadership of the Corleone fell to his protege, Bernardo Provenzano. Provenzano, known as Benu the Tractor for his methodical and unrelenting approach to crime, took over the reins of the organization in a more low-key manner. While Riina had thrived on violence and chaos, Provenzano sought to bring a more subtle, business-like approach to mafia operations. Under Provenzano, the Corleone shifted away from the extreme violence that had characterized Riina's rule. Provenzano focused on rebuilding the mafia's political and economic connections, particularly through real estate, construction, and waste management. He maintained a low profile, evading capture for over 40 years until he was arrested in 2006. By the time Provenzano's arrest, the Corleone had lost much of the power they once held under Riina's brutal leadership. In the years following Riina's downfall, the mafia as a whole began to decline. Increased law enforcement efforts, public opposition, and internal power struggles all contributed to the weakening of the organization. While the mafia still exists, it's a shadow of its former self, no longer wielding the same level of influence over Italian society. Salvatore Toto Riina died on November 17, 2017, a day after his 87th birthday, while serving his life sentence in a high-security prison in Parma, Italy. He had been suffering from cancer and other health complications, and his death marked the end of an era for the Sicilian Mafia. Riina died as he had lived, defiant, unapologetic, and unrepentant for the countless lives he had destroyed. Even on his deathbed, Riina never expressed remorse for his actions, and his death brought little solace to the families of his victims. Toto Riina's life was one of violence, power, and terror. He transformed the Sicilian Mafia into a fearsome criminal empire, using brutality and intimidation to achieve absolute control. His reign left a legacy of bloodshed that Italy is still grappling with today. Although Riina is gone, his impact on the Mafia and Italian society is undeniable. His story is a grim reminder of the destructive power of unchecked ambition and the consequences of a life lived in the shadows of crime. While the Mafia may no longer hold the same sway it did under Riina, the scars of his brutal reign will remain etched in the history of organized crime forever.